Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest and the first of two broadcasts today that Field Service News are doing that are in our new support channel for field service organisations that are trying to adapt in these times of the Covid-19 pandemic. Today's session is, or the first of today's sessions. I have a second session coming up later on this afternoon for those of you that haven't joined there. Where I'll be looking at remote assistance, and I'll be looking at how companies are utilizing remote assistance, how the use of that has changed across the last couple of weeks as well, with some in-depth knowledge from the team at Help Lightning, Gary York, the CEO there, and Evans Manolis, who is probably the man that knows more about that area than anyone else I've met anyway. Certainly a very, very in-depth level of knowledge for Evans. But today I'm speaking to Jan van Veen. Many of you will know Jan, especially if you are Field Service News subscribers, listeners to our podcast, etc. Jan has worked with me as a contributor, as well as working with me on a number of projects, including our think tank sessions where he co-moderates for many years. Well, I'm going to let Jan do a brief introduction of himself now, but Jan is an industry stalwart. He works with a number of very large organizations, a number of different organizations from different pockets, but predominantly a number of organizations that are quite forward thinking when it comes to service. The reason I've asked Jan to join me today is because he's been working with a number of those organizations that work with him in a community that's dedicated to service excellence. In some emergency rapid response groups, establishing some kind of best practice within the current situation. So Jan's going to kind of give us some of the insights that come from the number of the meetings that he's held, some of the calls that he's had, some of the kind of planning strategies he's done, and how the companies he's working with are approaching building a set of best practice working tools and processes during this time. Before I hand over to Jan to kind of give us an overview and an introduction, and then I'll be kind of interacting with Jan throughout the conversation. For those of you that are on the call as well, it would be great if you have any questions for Jan to please use the questions facility. That is a box on your go-to webinar panel. It may be at the top of your screen, maybe it's on the right of mine. It depends how you set up. But if you put questions through to there, I will make sure that we get those addressed as well to Jan. And any questions that we don't have time for during this 1 hour session, we will also make sure that I get those across to Jan, and Jan can react directly to you on email, as long as that's okay with you guys. Right, let's dive straight into it though, because obviously we're here to get the insight from Jan. Jan, thank you ever so much for taking the time to join me today. It's very much appreciated. We're all super busy trying to work our way through this. Perhaps you could give us some guidance on the learnings that you've been having, some of the conversations you've been having, what is emerging as best practice at the current time.
Yeah, so indeed, well, last time in our community we have been having several conversations, so that's small discussions, broader discussions, webinar, Q&A sessions, and one-to-one sessions to be able to collect the collective knowledge and experience and challenge, and that way make sure that none of us have to reinvent the wheel on service innovation in general, but now also more specific around this challenge we're having now with COVID-19. So very brief summary, and then we can have some questions and answers going on forward. I see a few things. First of all, overcoming the impact of Corona or COVID is not a short-term thing. First of all, Corona is probably going to stay with us for a while. It will not be one season, probably. It will be a couple of seasons. Nobody knows for sure, but that is something we have to take into account. And the impact is pretty huge. There are several things that can happen. So first of all, we have to respond right now to do the damage control, make sure that we survive it, that we stay safe, and that we have some continuity. But at the same pace, it will probably trigger some other developments in the next years. Potentially, we will run into an economic downturn. Not sure, but it could happen. So that is something we have to take into account. This is typically, these kind of events can trigger that. And the other thing which could also happen is that it may trigger some acceleration of some disruptive trends we were actually moving into anyway, but that can be accelerated right now. And that is a lot about digital, about service orientation, customer focus changing. So that means if we are talking about how to overcome the impact of Corona, there are 3 phases. Now it's rapid response, damage control, surviving, getting things in control. Then the next is a review phase where we have to look back to the learnings and look ahead what's coming up next. So look at what are the vulnerabilities, but also how what's going to happen with the economy and some other disruptive trends, and then start rethinking and redesigning our business continuity plan, our disaster recovery plan, but also our operating model and our business model with the value propositions and service offerings. And now the focus for actually most of the people and companies is still on the rapid response phase, phase 1. Although I do see some attention already moving towards, okay, but what does this mean? What are we going to learn from that, and what's going to happen next? But the focus predominantly is in the rapid response phase, phase 1. Now, for sure, that's all about safety, keeping people safe in your own company, your client's company, keeping the public safe. That is also about making sure that we continue our support to customers where needed, and making sure that the business stays ongoing, so the continuity of our business. Now, one of the things what I think is worthwhile sharing, because for sure there are a lot of discussions, how do we keep our people safe, how do we avoid running unnecessary risk on health, etc. I would like to raise basically 2 things. So let's say there are 3 clusters of best practices which are emerging. It's about structure, it's about operations, and it's about safety. And in structure, I see a difference in some companies. Some companies I see that everybody is fully engaged, proud to and eager to engage with clients where possible. Go to clients even though there is some risk there. But I also see that in other companies that the kind of panic mode starts to kick in. People are really afraid. They don't want to go to clients. They're concerned about to which extent leadership is really concerned about the health of their individuals, those kind of things going on. So then you see a lot of communication about very worst case stories, well, maybe even fake news kind of things, but a lot of noise on the line. So how are we going to avoid that? So that means we have to have some structure on a cascade of task forces, headquarter task forces, regional, local, on a daily action evolving what's going on, where do we need to intervene, what kind of actions, decisions do we need to take. Communication, be succinct, clear, to the point, not too much, not too little, and remove the clutter. And then there's one other thing which actually struck me yesterday is, so we see a few companies where engineers want to go to clients, particularly in healthcare and retail and food sector. They want to keep things going. That is their pride to keep on supporting clients. But on the other hand, some employees may have the fear to still go to clients. And that then the idea is, okay, but you know, we have to respect that fear. So some will go, and others, if they don't want to go, they are not going to be forced to go. And then at some point, a kind of ethical question arises: should we leave those kind of decisions with our employees? Because let's say, if we can say, well, if you don't want to go, you don't have to go. But on the other hand, if there's also job security and kind of imbalance of power going on, how honest is that perspective and that opinion or that decision of our employees? Or should we actually take that decision for them? I don't think there's a single answer, but I do think these kind of ethical things should be in mind as well when we have our discussions in our companies. without saying, hey, this is the only right answer. So as a kickoff, these are some things to share.
Okay, thanks, Jan.
Aspects.
Yeah, no, look, there's quite a lot to dive into there. I've got some questions that I'll kind of pick back apart some of the stuff you said, just to kind of zone in. Again, just so everybody listening in, if you do have questions on any of these, or in fact, if you want to share your learnings as well with the industry, with the room, please do use the questions panel that is available on the right hand side. Yeah, let's dig a little bit deeper. You mentioned the three kind of the areas in. I want to focus a little bit today, if we can. As much as I'm aware that there is the rapid response, and then there is the secondary processes. There's the potential cascade effect, as you mentioned, down to what that's going to mean to the global economy, and then what that it means to a service-related economy as well. But today, I think I'd like to zone in a little bit more on the rapid response, what people are doing right now in that first part. You mentioned the structures there, and you also meant there's structures. So, you know, the message needs to be coming from the top, but also coming down to regions, or coming down to specific regions within regions. In that sense,
Kris,
is there any clear...
I was offline for a second.
That's okay, we've still got you. Sorry, let me just reiterate the question.
I was offline.
No problems, no problems. So I just wanted to dig into the kind of hierarchy. You mentioned the different structures here. Are we seeing the most decisive action being driven from the top and then implemented more locally and more like within regions? I think you touched on communication as well. That's something I think would be good to get some kind of first-hand insight on, in terms of what that kind of communication looks like. But let's start with the hierarchy and the structural side of this. The companies you're working with, are they is the more impactful kind of responses, rapid response, being led by the more regional field service managers? I just get this feeling that in times of crisis, the more localized the leadership is, the more impactful it can be. In fact, we're even seeing that on the macro scale, as we see countries across Europe retaining this, reclaiming sovereignty and taking control of their own borders within the EU, as they deal with things on a nation by nation basis. And that's kind of a good kind of metaphor there for, you know, it's easier to deal with small, more manageable things. And I think that could translate to the team here, in the sense that, like I say, that more localized leadership. Is that something that's coming through? What with, how are they structuring that kind of leadership in this time?
So I think there are a few things in that. First of all, what we do see is that businesses who have a more decentralized structure, where the operations are, where the resources are, that they are, for them it's easier to mitigate and adjust with the different situations in different regions, different measures that are being taken by different countries, etc. Just very simple, the spare parts and availability for engineers, it's easier to adapt in that sense. But that's not necessarily also that's what is the command structure, or what I think you are referring to as well. So I think that I see is that companies are putting a kind of cascade of task forces where there is a shift. So there are some strict guidelines being put in place by the top, and that has to be adhered to. And then you do see that local leadership, whether it's service or general managers of a country, that they have to take their ownership as well to adjust locally, do what is needed to do to adjust within the boundaries which are being set by top management. So no, this is not a kind of crisis you can fully control by purely top management, crisis management. It has to be a cascade down where everybody has their own ownership and also to some extent some autonomy. to adapt to things. Maybe to add to that, part of adjusting your operations model, where we now see that different teams, local teams, start becoming creative. How can we still serve our clients even with all the kind of restrictions we're having? That kind of creativity and adaptive power, you can only have that if everybody is taking ownership of that and has some certain of autonomy in doing things. And that's something else in the top-down structure, as you were referring to. So yeah,
a quick point on that, very briefly before I've got a couple of questions from the audience. A quick point on that. Are you seeing the companies that you're working with kind of increasing or introducing the number of leadership kind of calls? I know Jed, who was on the call with us on Friday, when I was talking to him, Jed, for those of you who are on the call, is the head of direct service for Konica Minolta. He was saying that they've introduced digital coffee catch-ups where the kind of key stakeholders will sit around first thing in the morning, they're having a call, and he's actually to talk about that, to your point there, Jan, he mentioned that he's talking about they'll have they're starting early, they'll have an executive briefing, and then they will have the regional meetings, and then the regional at the end of the day, the regional kind of leaders will also just spend half an hour to an hour on a call just to jam out, look, hey, do you know what, this is what we've done in Benelux, and this is working. Do you know what, actually I don't think that would work with us in the UK. That kind of conversation, is that something that you're seeing from the leadership teams that you're working with?
So the typical 15-minute calls to start the day, to really discuss the status, the changes, and any kind of decisions to action points, and that got cutting down to more regional and local level. And I think we also have to take into account that at the end it should even go to, let's say, engineer level, that they will have frequent contact with their manager. First of all, that is a source of information, that is a source of concern. It's also making sure that everybody feels that they're in the same boat and keeping them engaged, keeping them confident, and that they feel the trust. And this is going to take some time, so we have to make sure that also in the mindset and we keep people on board, and that only works if you communicate enough with each other. But we do have to focus on being to the point. So a lot of communication is not necessarily the right solution, but we have to make sure that we communicate about the right things, and it is two direction. So not just telling, but also listening and adapting and reacting to that.
Okay. A question here from Jeremy Telesinas. I hope I said that correctly, Jeremy. Jeremy asks, can you share some reasons why this crisis will accelerate digital transformation?
Yeah. So by the way, first of all, none of us have crystal ball, so we are not sure what's going to happen next, how much time this is going to take, what the consequence will be in terms of economic downturn or disruption. So these are scenarios. So take them as such. This could happen, and if that happens, what will that mean for your business, for your business unit, and are you ready for it? And if not, what to do to make sure you're ready. So the bigger picture and in the context. So why could this accelerate disruption? A few things. It could be, first of all, that we see a shift in clients embracing and adopting new technologies and new offerings, like being connected and having data going outside the company. That often is a reason that in some industries developments have been slower than in other areas, and this could trigger a kind of acceleration of that to make sure that in the future the business continuity of your clients are secured. That could be a simple one. The other one is, if this is going to turn into an economic crisis with a lot of pressure on cost, then typically you see that the majority of the companies start just surviving the crisis or the downturn, wait until it's better, and then start scaling up without changing much in how they work and any innovation. But others are working on innovation, and they will typically be the winners out of an economic downturn. So quite often we see these kind of disruptive change happening at the end of the crisis when we start coming up. What could that mean is those who have been changing, innovating and developing, that they are the winners after the economic downturn, and the rest are being left behind and have no opportunity to benefit from any kind of developments going on. So that is in an abstract way. I think an example closest to field service at this moment with digital things going on is connectivity, data-driven services, predictive maintenance. If there's more cost pressure from our clients, some companies will innovate more massively in this, be ready for it, and therefore be more attractive for clients and therefore win from this. And that could be a kind of disruption if the advantage is that big that they will win and the others will not. By the way, it's not necessarily said that manufacturers will be the winners. It could also be the system integrators who are in a better position to play this game towards your clients. Again, these are hypotheses or scenarios which could happen. And I think one of the important things in the review phase, in the sense, so once we are behind, have the rapid response phase behind us, that we have to investigate these different scenarios and assess them, and based on that, draw up a plan on how to move forward. Is that enough answer?
Yeah, Jeremy, if you want to add any further comment, please use the chat box. I've sent you a message privately there just to acknowledge your question, and you know, if you have any further kind of insight or response, we'll come back to that in a little bit. My kind of 2 pence worth on this as well, just very briefly, is, you know, as somebody that's been writing about digital transformation for a number of years, you know, especially around things like augmented reality and remote assistance. I mean, I feel like I've been banging that drum for forever, and I've always asked the question, why aren't people adopting this? And the simple answer was because it was a nice to have, but it was never a must have. The same to a lesser degree goes to the IoT and the connected assets. These things are all things that are in place, you know, things that are in existence, and it's always my view on it is that field service is such a mission critical part of any business that has a field service operation, that big projects like implementing an IoT setup or kind of bringing in AR solutions, etc. I've always said these need to be done on an iterative approach. I believe that. I don't think you can boil the ocean. But the problem is when things are done like that, if there's always a fire to fight, it's finding the time to do it. And many best in practice organizations within the field service sector globally that I've worked with have found time to do that. It was there was seeping into that. We were seeing that digital transformation curve. Obviously, it's been at top of the agenda at most conferences for a couple of years now. However, the crisis environment is something that always will give that little push forwards. We have to take that leap, and it's whether we see. I think I mentioned this on the last call that we did, the wider emergency symposium. There is a great Churchillian quote that I love, which is the pessimist sees the challenge in the opportunity, and the optimist sees the opportunity in the challenge. I've probably mangled that, but you get the point. And at the moment, even though these are tough times for everybody, I do see huge opportunity to drive the industry forwards. Please do keep questions coming in as well. I just want to circle a little bit back to some of the best practice conversations, Jan, around engineers. It's something that we kind of touched on a little bit whilst you were kind of giving your initial thoughts and summaries. There is this challenge, isn't there, around we can't use carrot, we can't use stick. These are unprecedented times. You know, if our engineers don't feel comfortable going out into the world, then we can't really force them to. At the same time, those engineers that do want to go out and like you say, wear it as a badge of honor, to be there to keep going to support their clients, They need protection as well. But let's kind of circle back a little bit on this challenge around if an engineer turns around and says, look, I'm sorry, I'm just not comfortable to kind of fulfill my role. Obviously, that's going to have a financial impact on the business. But is there ways that any of the organizations you're working with are able to take those engineers in that situation, or even engineers that validly are in self-isolation, still well enough to work, but are having to self-isolate? Are there ways that we can redistribute that knowledge, that experience? And are we seeing that? Are we seeing them kind of move to kind of triage centers or remote triage centers on their mobiles, etc.? Is there a practical way that the companies you're working with are able to kind of handle that challenge?
Yeah. So let's decouple this from the idea or the aspect of employees not willing to go to a client, yes or no. So what we do see in general is that there's a lot of relocation and reassignment going on of capacity resources. And how that really depends on the type of industry, the region, and the type of clients. So I have heard from companies where they see a dramatical decrease of demand for field engineers because the installations are being postponed, preventive maintenance is being postponed. It's only very urgent corrective maintenance, and then often also in the mode of let's just see how we can come over this period instead of having a solid repair, but just kind of quick fix to keep things going. And therefore, a lot of engineers, I think 1/3 of the engineers of this particular company were put into production in the manufacturing plant to keep on producing equipment and spare parts. As an example, and by the way, also after they had made some precautions to make sure that the manufacturing plant was safe, so compartmentalized, whole factory, etc., etc. Another example is having field engineers going more into remote assistance. So either assisting engineers on site, local engineers or subcontractors on site, or maybe even a subcontractor of your client, let them do the work with support from a field engineer with a phone connection and an image, a video connection. And even in some instances, just doing some knowledge work. So keep on being productive, but a lot of reassignments and relocations going on. Yeah.
How are the engineers adapting in that kind of environment as well? And something else to touch on there is this is something that Ali Pinder mentioned. I'm going to do a session more in depth on this with Ali next week. So anyone that's not subscribed to Field Service News and you've registered for this on one of the different channels, obviously there's a lot of various people coming together to help promote these sessions at the moment. So just a small heads up, we will be continuing to push out as far as we can, far and wide. We've got a series of conversations continuing to go to help companies in this environment. So do hit fieldservicenews.com/subscribe. Sorry, Jan, didn't mean to put a plug in the middle of that. It just came to my mind. But I am speaking to Ali next week on this topic, but I'd love to get your thoughts as well. If you recall, Ali touched on how do we make the engineers feel valued at this time, which I think is a huge question, because it's not only how do we make sure that we've got their buy-in right now, which feeds out of what we were saying there, and also how do we get their buy-in to move roles or to readapt? And so suddenly, change is a challenge for everybody, and we're all going through huge change, and we know that from the change management best practices. How are the companies that you've been speaking to kind of reinforcing to their engineers, or are they reinforcing to their engineers just how valuable an asset, how valuable they are as part of the team at the moment, but also thinking again to that review stage where we hit that, if potentially hit that global downturn, good engineers are going to be a very, very well sought after prospect, and we don't want to be in a situation where our engineers look at the way we've looked after them in the last few months to say, do you know what, I'm a hot prospect on the property market, and I didn't feel loved. I didn't feel looked after. I didn't feel they had my back. I'm going. How do we stop that happening? So there's a dual challenge there. How do we get them to buy in now? And how do we make sure that that continues through to when we do hopefully all come out of this and tackle the next chunk of this challenge?
I think I see two layers in that. Let's say there are companies where indeed engineers have the idea that they are an afterthought. And those are the companies who are having more difficulties at this moment. But you can't fix that now in one single moment. You say, okay, but you are so important, while all the time we didn't say that, and now we do say it.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
So I'm not. This is a concern. Then on the other hand, we have companies where engineers were always seen as an important factor, not necessarily more important than others, but just as important. And the same case at this moment. So I do not hear a lot about, okay, but this is the time to put more emphasis on how important engineers are compared to before and maybe afterwards. I do think it's important for all employees to make sure that we communicate and engage them in a way to survive this very threatening and difficult time. It's not just the threat or the challenge around potential infections. It's also about working from home with your families and your kids, what have you. So that is quite disruptive in your family life, not being able to see friends. We are kind of being disconnected. So our social life is kind of on a halt. So all these kind of things are what we have to compensate by making sure that we are in contact. But I also think that is part of the communication or the structure part is maybe it's good, and that is what I see some companies doing, is to kind of reinforce and maybe even adjust what is the mission and the purpose of our company. So make it specific to this period. What are we working on? What is our mission together in the next period? And that is something we are all focused on, including field service engineers. I don't think it's a good statement to say field engineers are now at this moment more important than the others. We all have to do our job, and we also have to do some relocation. So at some point, maybe even other people have to support the field operations, even though that's not their job. So we do see that some people are not very happy with their new role in this period. Hey, but that's a situation. No? So we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, that's
I don't think
interesting.
it's a very specific answer, but I didn't notice that people now companies are having a different attitude and perception about it. I do see that there are differences in how they're now struggling to keep people on board and engaged and avoiding panic and clutter and noise.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a valid point, actually. It would almost feel it would feel very forced if you said if it's not already intrinsically embedded within the corporate culture that you make and you should make all staff feel valued. It is a challenge for some organizations with engineers because by their very definition they're more isolated, and I find the companies that have long retention rates and have that engendered loyalty within their field service staff are the ones that have the structures there where the field service managers are able to do that regular kind of interaction to make sure it is. And you're right, actually, it's not something that can be retrofitted without it looking like it's been done in a very forced, clumsy manner, which would probably have an even more negative impact anyway. It's interesting you say about it being a different switch. I hadn't even thought about that. I don't know if anybody else on this call has kind of considered that as well. I think that's a good takeaway, that it's, in these times, like I say, I think I might start raising a fundraiser for every time I say unprecedented. I might give £1 to my favorite charity, but I think they'll be quite rich quite quickly. But in these unprecedented times, it is a good thought that if field staff aren't potentially, if that's there where we feel on the ground, then there could be other ways to facilitate other workers within the organisation taking on the role of field staff, especially as we touched on with Jeremy's question around digitalisation, and especially coming onto the call a little bit later with remote assistance. That knowledge can be dialed in, so it could just be that it's moving those bodies around. That's quite an interesting concept, actually.
May I say one thing?
Sorry, please, mate. Yeah, please.
Because one of the challenge always with field engineers is that they are remote workers.
Yeah.
So they always have less connection with the rest of the organization and colleagues than in office workers. So that and that is what you do see is at these times it is more important to make sure that you stay closer with your engineers. Not saying, hey, but you're very important, but stay close to them, listen to them, talk with them, help them, etc. And that is, I think, quite important in this period, because otherwise you may run the risk that there's more disconnect and that's being enlarged instead of closed in this time.
Yeah, I mean, they're essentially more vulnerable to that as is, just by the definition of their role, and that's just, it's just put under the magnifying glass at the minute, and it's something that if you're not paying attention to that previously, yeah, it doesn't have to be forced, but just putting some processes in place to make sure there's check-ins, make sure there's, like I said, Jed's idea of a digital coffee call, which he'll have a service manager that's responsible for maybe 15, 20 guys within a region, and they'll kind of just make 50. That's it. That manager will make time for literally over a call like this, grab a coffee. Hey, how is everything doing? This is what the schedule is. Are you coping okay? Just that little bit of an arm around the shoulder, I think, goes a long way at the moment. Right, let's just have a look at the questions. Sorry, I'm manning the questions and the interviews today, so I apologize if I keep looking away from the screen. I've got a question from Andy Lawrence. What steps might companies be looking at to overcome the inevitable productivity lag when service calls have not been fulfilled? It's an excellent question, Andy. Thank you very much for submitting that. I think it's something that we're all concerned about, is how do we catch up? That's going back to that review stage. Especially certain organizations, those that have key workers, those that are working in utilities, for example, those that are keeping, the infrastructure running, probably won't actually suffer this so much. Those that are in, especially business to consumer sectors, I'm thinking like people like telcos, pay TV, that kind of thing. They're going to hit a huge kind of backlog, aren't they? How are they going to catch up? And are any of the members of your community in that space? Is there any kind of advice and insight from your side of things on that? Thanks again, Andy. Good question.
Very good question. To be honest, I haven't heard much about that concern, in that sense that that's not the problem right now, but that will indeed be a problem soon. Good question. I don't have a clear answer on it. I can't share any particular experiences on that, or observations on that. There is one interesting thing which is quite opposite to many others. I see some companies who have to ramp up volume at this moment, partly because they are in the production of either tests or protective gear. They all have to ramp up production. Some of them also have to ramp up servers. Imagine many producers of the tests, they also produce the equipment to do the tests on. So those are laboratory equipment. And there is not a choice to delay preventive maintenance, plant maintenance, because the accuracy of the test is all related to constantly making sure that you have done your maintenance and the calibrations, etc., etc. So they have to ramp up everything and make sure, and that is not just double the volume, but 10 times the volume as they were used to, and somehow they're coping with it. But this is not an answer you're looking for. So I think that will require another call like this soon.
Yeah.
Not a satisfactory answer this, but it is as it is.
No, Look, we can only answer what's in our sphere, and if we try to answer stuff beyond our sphere, then that's less useful and almost damaging. So I appreciate your candor on that. I will give my thoughts on it, just because I've just literally finished writing, and again, you know, my job is just to report on the industry. I respect and I report on and follow what you guys in the audience, people like Jan and the people that Jan works with. I'm just a conduit, and I learn from each and every one of you every single time I speak to somebody. One thing I've been working on a little bit recently is the gig economy, the rise of the blended workforce. Blended workforce is where we mix contingent labor or third-party labor and the embedded kind of internal field service workforce. I've got a couple of white papers I've just written on that. In fact, I've got one that's going out today, actually, funnily enough, that is talking about the grown-up gig economy. And that's, when we think about the gig economy, we quite often we think Deliveroo, we think Uber. There's actually a burgeoning market for experienced field service staff. I think that could be one answer. I think if, like I say, I'm just a conduit. I'm no expert, but my kind of thinking is that the gig economy, once we get out of this, could be how we plug the gaps. It certainly is in terms of real-time operating. Service organisations have been using third-party workers for seasonality. You know, the HVAC sector, for example, tends to rely quite heavily on this, and also to expand into different territories. It's been very common across America. I'm not sure if this is a solely European call, if anyone from the States has joined us. I know it's early doors out there, but it's something that a lot of American companies, a lot of the mid-tier or even small SMBs have utilized to expand. The alliance of that with technologies like remote assistance, augmented reality, etc., and also knowledge surfacing, knowledge banks, is an important part of this. It goes back to Jeremy's question around the digitalization as well. All of these aspects can allow us to get somebody that's got that basic skill set that we know, right, we know that, I'm going to put this in the old parlance, we know they can use a wrench. Obviously, things are a lot more complicated than that these days, but they have that skill set to undertake maintenance. But they may not have the experience and the insight on the specific assets that you as an OEM or you as a service provider are serving. However, if you can give them somebody over their shoulder to guide them through those challenges that they don't know, then they can ramp up, then they can step up, and that could perhaps fill the volume within that because there is a huge backlog that's going to be there. Like I say, that's just a couple of thoughts there. I will put some links when we do the follow-up to the white papers that I'm referring to as well. There's one about the blended economy in general, and there's one about the rise of the exactly what I talk about, the grown-up gig economy, which I like. But thank you again, Andy. I think
so potentially we also see if we have been delaying preventive maintenance, then you may also expect an increase of incidents at some point because of the delayed preventive maintenance. Probably we will also have some strategies here, as also here flatten the curve. So try to kind of spread the increase of the backlog, so that you have some time to overcome it, increase your capacity, maybe even stretch some interventions you did now by having other people doing the work with support like we're doing now because we can't travel.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to be a bit creative there. And part of it is on the short term. What I do see, by the way, is that some companies can take much more radical interventions now by using augmented reality, etc., to support clients or other contractors, because they have already been investing in this for a while. So they are more or less have some infrastructure which they can ramp up now. And similarly, if you are in that space, then you also have other options to ramp up for picking up on the backlog. But yeah, how much time do you have for it?
Yeah, so I think as well, Jan, this goes back to you, like you said, a lot of the companies in your community and in the workshops that you've been doing and in these kind of crisis calls you've been holding. You mentioned right at the top, some of them are still in this rapid response, and some companies are still going to be in dare I say it, headless chicken mode. You know, they're panicking, they're running around, they still haven't taken the time to stop. It's just an aside on that. It's what I would call being in the weeds. I've spent a long time working in hospitality many years ago and running bars and restaurants. In the weeds is where you're just running around so much. You've got too much you can handle. You have to stop. That was always our advice. Stop, make the plan, and then move. And sometimes, no matter how much firefighting, how big that fire is, it makes sense to stop and work out a plan how to fight it rather than just go and get the nearest fire extinguisher. But Jan, the point I was getting to, sorry, is those companies that have moved beyond rapid response and are also, and these are, I assume these are tandem. It's not you do rapid response, then you move on to review and plan. But I would imagine it's those companies that are in that also review phase as well now. Those are the ones that will be ready for that backlog. Those ones are the ones that are already making the plans for the challenge that Andy's kind of laid out there. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think rapid response is more than firefighting.
Yeah, okay.
So it is crisis management. Typical, what is part of crisis is things are happening to us. We don't know exactly the answer yet. We have to improvise. We have to get control back. We're still struggling with unpredictable things going on. So the situation still is quite unpredictable. And if you're just in firefighting mode, you will continue in firefighting mode. So the challenge here is how can you get back into control as quick as possible, get a kind of stable situation which becomes more predictable. That doesn't mean that everything is fine. Maybe you still are having too high cost, lack of revenue, or all those kind of problems, but you can somehow handle them. They're in control, under control, and then you can start working, okay, and how can we now improve for the longer term? And maybe part of that is also how are we going to overcome the backlog? Yeah. So if you just keep on doing headless chicken firefighting, it will take too long and actually more than a crisis period is worth. I think a crisis is something else than a downturn. A downturn is the economy is lower. Crisis is we don't know what to do. And we have to figure out what to do. So I think that's the difference between best practice rapid response or headless chicken rapid response.
Yeah. Is it
the good companies, they will be sooner in the space that they can start thinking about what's next. And I think that's your point, huh?
Yeah, exactly. It is, like I say, it is. I suppose, yeah, what you say essentially really echoes what I was trying to get to, just much more eloquently. We do need to just stop sometimes and plan and think, put the brain in gear.
Think. If you're in a hurry, first stop and think.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And spend first 90% of the time on thinking about the problem and then and the solution, and then start doing it. On the other hand, we also have to act first rapidly now. So it's always easier said than done. But the focus should be also about getting control back, and then we can start moving further.
A quick question I've got for you, Jan, on that. This is kind of coming to my mind. And again, looking at the time, guys, we kind of got 10 minutes before we wrap up. So if you've got any final questions, please pop them in. I've just seen a question come in from Eric. I will get to that one in a second. Eric van Groningen. Again, I apologize if I've got the pronunciation poor, Eric, but yeah, we'll get to that one in a second. Any other questions, please do pop them in as well, and we'll get through as many as we can. Jan, I just wanted to ask a quick question on this difference between rapid response as activity A and review and plan and prepare for the fallout as activity B. Are any of the companies that you're doing you're working with, sorry, are any companies you're working with, has anybody separated that out and said, right, this is going to be our rapid response team. You guys are going to be responsible for dealing with how we as an organization act, how we communicate with our engineers, how we do our structure, all of these good things you mentioned earlier. And you, team B, your guys are you're not focusing on this at all. I just want you to go away and come up with the strategy, the planning for how we cope with the backlog of service calls we have, how we cope with the economic downturn. You guys go away and get the planning ready for the next phase of this. Is anyone doing that? Because that would seem like a sensible approach if you've got the man hour to do it. And obviously with everyone in lockdown, there is an abundance of hours for certain organizations, even if it's, like we say, pulling people that may not be used to doing that role.
No, I don't see that. I do see that, well, first of all, I do see that companies are isolating the phases. So we now are in the rapid response. That's all hands on deck. That may take a longer period than we think now, or maybe not. We don't know how long it's going to take, but that is now our concern. We have to focus on that. The whole focus, the organization, the task force are all focused on getting a grip on the situation and the rapid response. I do see that people start thinking and having some thoughts about what the impact will be on the longer term, but also very deliberate to say, okay, but the review phase is not now, that's later. So in our intensive group where we have more intensive exchange meetings, they have said, well, let's have a focus as a group on that, hopefully mid of April, but time will tell. So that okay. I don't think it's a good idea now to say, okay, now we have a separate team who are already going to work on the review, because also there you want to involve your entire organization. Mm-hmm. There will be separate roles for the more radical changes that you will have some satellite teams for that. But then you start organizing for innovation and change. That's another phase. I don't think it's very good to have too much overlap in that.
Yeah.
One slight exception could be is that we see that there's now more time focused also on reviewing and adjusting the business continuity plan. But to be honest, I don't think that is a long-term change, but that's still focused on the short term. We have to survive this period and make sure we do the right thing. So that's my observation, and I also think it makes sense. That's also the purpose of having these 3 different phases, to make sure that we do the right thing at the right time with the right people.
Okay, cool. Appreciate that. Okay, Eric's question. Eric van Groningen from VBR Turbine Partners. Eric's dropped in and said, good afternoon. I see many of our customers still being in the panic mode and not switching to the longer term view. Is there a way that we as service providers can stimulate or support them to switch to the next phase? Thanks again for the question, Eric.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that, let's say, the forward-linking, more kind of leadership companies could take that role, and that also would be your added value and your brand in the market to kind of lead that shift and that transition. So yes, by the way, that is a different capability. I'm not sure if it's the right time to start forcing your clients now into the long-term thinking, but maybe more, how are we going to have a more best practice rapid response approach to make sure that we're not the headless chickens, but yet we are getting control, we as a windmill manufacturer and service provider, but also you as a windmill farm company or utilities company. So try to play the right role at the right time, and I don't think it's now already so much on the long term. Maybe there's a bit of a difference in some industries, but I haven't heard that yet.
Okay.
I can imagine windmills, utilities, it's more long-term. Things are always more important, but still, I think we are now still mitigating a crisis.
Is this the time? Is this the time for? I suppose it's transcends.
May I ask you one thing, Kris? By the way.
Yeah, sure.
So let's avoid that we all have the truth in hand and have the silver bullets. So back to the question, I actually kind of said, do the right thing at the right time. So don't force clients now into long-term thinking. Maybe that's a bit too strict. I think more important is stay close to your customers, listen, understand, and then you will always so have the right timing when it's time to shift gears into long term. And maybe in your case, it is sooner than in most others. Could be, but stay close to your customers, talk with them, understand them, and also now try to have a better picture of what their challenges than maybe they have. And then you can have that kind of leadership role and also do the timing right. So maybe that's a more to the point answer to make sure you do the right thing. Sorry, Kris.
No problem. In fact, what your answer kind of echoed where I was going to go anyway with that. I was going to say, is now the time, and this statement I think probably transcends field service, but I think it applies to all business. Certainly in my business, some of the suppliers that we work with have been conspicuously absent. Some of the suppliers that we've worked with, in fact, I'm very pleased to say the vast majority have shown fantastic leadership and have further endeared themselves to me as a small business owner by offering services and advice and guidance, and just like you say, being that little bit closer to me as the customer. I think it's in times like this that leadership, whether that just be being close, that being close to your customers, you say, whether it be being a voice in your industry, whether it be a voice for your customers, but being there to help people take control, even not necessarily to take control. That's what I see us as trying to do here. It's not to try and take control. We don't have the magic bullets, and as many, as much as I can open up my black book of people 10 times smarter than me that like Jan and Ali and everybody else that will be joining us across the next couple of weeks, to take their time to influence. That's us trying to help us all together take control of this challenge. And so I suppose that just speaks to your point there, Jan. It's being close to the customers, and it's being seen to be there if they need them, and being there to have that conversation with them. It's being there to kind of push back on some bad ideas, push forward some good ideas. These are all they're fundamentals and basics. They're fundamentals of business, and they're fundamentals of leadership. But it's in times of crisis that the fundamentals really, really ring true. I'm just looking at the time, and we're pretty much coming up to the end of the session. I'd just like to say thank you to everybody that has taken the time to join us. I'm just going to share a couple of links with you via the chat, guys. First of all, I'd just like to pop Jan, I'm going to send a link to moreMomentum. Whilst I'm doing this, perhaps if you want to just mention the community, because of course there's a link to this in the link I've sent you. We'll be sending a copy of the video out to everybody. I'll follow up with an email to everybody that will say, hey, here's a link to moreMomentum and Jan's community. If you want to join that and work with Jan on some of the not just in the COVID-19.
Maybe more useful now. It's moreMomentum.eu/corona. It's not necessarily the community, but that is, let's say, the things we're doing around the coronavirus.
Okay, I'll pop that in there as well.
We'll put a practical guide for the rapid response phase containing, let's say, 10 best practice areas, and that will be available next week. So I think that is more sensible at this moment than the community, to be honest.
Okay, so I put that link out there as well. Jan, if people want to reach out to you from this call, are you comfortable with me sharing your email with the guys there as well? Can I put that in there?
Yeah.
It's Jan at moreMomentum.
Van Veen.
Jan, sorry, dot. It's just sorry. Dot. Van Veen is one word, yeah.
Yes.
At moreMomentum.
Kris.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, pop it into the chat for us, Jan. That'd be fantastic. Similarly, most of you guys probably already have my email address, but if you want to reach out to us at any point, if you have ideas of areas that I should be covering for this session, for these sessions, like I say, I'm trying to put as many as we can together to try and help the industry as well, and I'm always open to ideas. Finally, if you are not yet a subscriber to fieldservicenews.com, I'm going to pop a link to the subscription link in there. That is obviously our primary channel, and that's where you can access all of our various elements. We have an ongoing library of educational materials for field service professionals. We do have free to access at fieldservicenews.com, a Covid-19 channel, which is providing not only articles, links, also has a list of all of the vendors that have stepped up to the plate during this crisis, solution providers, educational providers. There's a raft of materials there, so it's being updated daily. That's a good place to go if you're looking for more guidance. If you want to subscribe to fieldservicenews.com, there is a sponsored complimentary subscription available, which is there, and that won't cost you anything other than occasionally getting an email from one of our sponsors. Or if you'd like to support us in another way, there are a couple of paid for tiers as well, which give you certain additional access to community groups and chat rooms and stuff like that. But other than that, I think it's just time for me to say thank you everybody on the call for taking the time to listen in. I know everybody's very busy. Most importantly, Mr. Van Veen, it's a pleasure as always, my friend, and thank you very much for taking your time to share your insight with the community here at Field Service News. And stay safe, everybody. We're going to get through this all, and we'll come out. We won't just come out surviving. We're going to come out thriving. I'm sure of that. As some of the questions responded to, you know, digital transformation. We've all been talking about it for forever. We've got to do it now. But the good thing is we've been talking about it forever because it was the right thing to do.
And we have to do it together, Kris, all together. Together we're much stronger as a community. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. On that closing note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for your time, and we'll see you all again soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.